centered around ideas of spirituality, mostly coming from my fascination with religious studies as a literary genre. I'm inspired by and try to emulate qualities of Persian miniatures, Buddhist Thangka painting, Chinese landscape painting, and AI art, because I believe that these forms of art share the purpose of attempting to illustrate the spiritual world in their own unique way. I believe that it's possible to find one's own unique way of understanding, expressing oneself through trying to understand and reconcile from different cultural values and viewpoints. I try to focus on conventions I've become familiar with through the Hofberger program, such as plane separation, using elements such as shapes and figures to form more intriguing compositions, and thinking of different parts of the painting as color zones. I'm trying to grapple with the challenge of thinking about these conventions as I plan and paint, and still trying to develop my form and content as I respond to critiques and studio visits. I try to derive benefit from listening to what people think the paintings mean and how they think the formal elements of the painting are operating, and what could change about them or possibly be better. And I try to use this also, these meetings also to derive inspiration for what I might try to make next.
Make next? Okay. Okay.
I really like this painting right here because I can see like how much effort you put into, especially in Chinese landscape painting, because I've noticed like there are dots that looks like triangle. I don't know if is that your intention, but I've learned about, like there are some kind of dots that made by ink that is like by you kind of rotate the brush a certain way, and that can be applied like in the Chinese painting way, and you use it in a brush stroke that is like from Western, and I think that's really amazing. And I think that amount of details you pay attention with also, it's just like kind of like translating the Chinese painting in a way that I've never seen. And I also like how you talk about AI painting, because I feel like it's probably cherry blossom, and it's just like such a kind of symbolic things that, especially in Japanese culture and also many Eastern culture. And I think how you arrange everything in the, like you said, like conventional way, but it just makes sense together with the amount of detail and attention you pay, you bring inside the painting.
Yeah, I think the color scheme overall is working for me. I think the self-portrait you did really helped you to kind of like combine your, because you have always have that draft skill like really well, putting things in and details, but there was like moments where the colors were kind of separated, but now it just feels like everything is honing into each other. And I feel like that also has to do with like the fact that you wrote your statement. I think that was one of the best introductions you had for your paintings. And I guess like, the painting is the painting, but as the painter, like you have to kind of understand, like, or at least like put it into words. And I think it's interesting to me to see that happening so well at the same time.
To go off the AI comment, I do find that there's like an algorithmic quality to these in terms of you have your influences, you can insert them and play with them and like see what generate new results by putting these distinct elements together. But through practice, I think you've developed a really like Isaac was saying, they hold themselves together, and they each do feel like part of a set, but independent.
We sort of have a, like, they sort of use Buddhism and like Hindu culture in the way that like Americans experience it, in like a commercial way. Like realistically, how the Christian society of, let's say, America experiences these religions when you go to Chinatown and you see them in like a shop, and there's no real like deeper connection to these religions that like a general like United States of America population has to these things, as like a, I'm speaking from like white Anglo-Christian like lineage in America, and so there's this sort of like, there's a sort of commercialized aspect to these. There's a sort of like lighthearted grabbing of those religions to these, which I think is in some ways interesting and speaks to like an AI culture. It's like you can just grab anything and it's like great. But they kind of just operate as like someone walking by and like seeing them in a sort of like passive relationship. That's sort of how I'm reading them.
I feel like with the AI thing, like I can understand why you included that, but I definitely think that your work ends up in a different place than what AI does, and I mean that as a compliment, because I think like AI takes a lot of just like different tropes, like cultural tropes, and I don't know, my understanding of it, like as when I think about it as like artwork that it creates, it just turns it into like this swirling, like surrealist, psychedelic void that doesn't really have it doesn't have a narrative like how your paintings do. Like because of the clarity of these paintings, I can read so easily a narrative, or I can understand that there is some sort of implication of a narrative at least, and like AI does not have that at all. It's just like these things have just been like ripped from their history and turned upside down into like they don't really mean anything. Like I can tell that even though I don't understand anything about like Buddhism or Hinduism, like I can understand that they are here for a reason, and that they are adding to some sort of narrative, even if it doesn't really, even if it like is not totally in touch with its origins or something.
And I feel like with AI, there's this immediacy, like it's easy to, there's this quickness to AI, and that's not in these at all to me. Like these are contemplative. They take a long time for you to make, and then for us to process as the viewer. Like, and we spend more time with these than with AI. So it makes sense that you have, like, these are more involved than, like, for you than
I mean, maybe I have a different impression of what AI is, but I think they seem like it's exactly what Joe is saying. I mean, AI works by being able to learn patterns, right? Like, so it can translate something from English to Chinese without knowing English or Chinese. It does not need to know the languages. It just has so much data that it can compare enough times when a word is used in one place, and then so it matches that same thing, right? It's just like an enormous pattern machine that in that way it can translate, if you see what I mean. Like, so there's not and I do think it is an interesting like what Grant is saying is interesting to me, like what one culture sort of sees in something else, the context has changed. So what do you sort of do with the same information in the new context? In a way, it operates similarly to AI because you sort of use it, maybe if the culture you're living in this case is more image-based, then what sort of way are you tracking that thing today, creating, what pattern do you see in it, so to speak? Anyway, I also see these very much as involved in pattern, and I think that they have a lot of those contemporary, they feel contemporary in that way.
I want to talk about that subject too, in light of what Grant said, because I thought he put it very well. But I'm not so interested. I'm not trying to validate or invalidate so much as trying to describe what I see it as doing. The consumption of culture aspect of them that Grant was talking about, the way that a Western observer would go through Chinatown or look at an Indian visual art in an Indian restaurant or something like that. I do find that there's a kind of rendering meaningless the cultural background of the imagery. I'm not trying to say that's not valid or that that's bad, but that's the way I understand them. And one reason for that is, if you've got a painting like the Goblins here, all of the iconography is treated the same, whether it's Christian or Hindu or Buddhist or comic book or fairy tales. It's all the same. And so that really makes me feel this sort of on the AI zone of where there's no real affect toward the image. Now, sometimes you talk about it, and now I'm switching from the paintings to what you say. Sometimes you talk about it as if your ambition were a kind of straightforward spirituality. If that were the case, then I would find that problematic, because that's not what the paintings seem to be doing to me. But then when you add AI as an element, that kind of throws the whole thing question wide open again. So if you're talking about religions as religions, plus AI, well, what does that mean? And so maybe trying to figure out what that means is what the paintings are trying to do. But I think as you work on your artist statement over the next couple of months, that has to be folded into it somehow, why do we get goblins and Buddha? That's fine, but I'd like to hear about why. On a formal level, however, is this the newest one, Joe? I think that painting has a lot of amazing stuff in it. I think you talked about it in your statement, the sort of color zones, the way you use patterns of marks, the whole composition of it, and it's like garrulousness, is really quite something. I think that's an amazing piece of work. Is that if there's a tension between the notion of religiosity and the undermining of that notion in the paintings, then I think that ought to be articulated somehow more clearly in the statement.
Yeah, maybe it's like this idea of like study versus embodiment. Like, even without the idea of AI, it's like a lot of this is like image regurgitation with like a study regurgitating what's been studied, but there's no embodiment or like feeling of what that spirituality is or what those images represent or symbolize. And I feel like maybe that has to do with the way the paint is applied. Like, a friend of mine recently said
it's really important to understand the relationship between the materiality of the paint and the materiality of what is being painted. And there's something here where it's like, they're so ambitious and like there's so much information that there's something I lose in terms of what things feel like. Like, I see what they look like, but it's almost like there's no feeling at all in the imagery or in the paint. It's like the textures are described, but they're not felt. And I know that's like kind of woo-woo, like how do you really get to that point, but, and like maybe that is where AI comes in, and what Fox had said about patterns, where it's not embodied practice, it's a study of these things, a regurgitation of these things. And when there's no more feeling left, like what is there? And like sometimes they're kind of painful to look at because there's so much description. Like the far piece, it like hurts my eyes. But then these are a bit softer where I'm able to enter them and like rest my eyeballs on like the petals of the flowers or the skies.
Yeah, I feel like honestly the trees in here, I see that like those feel more felt than described. There's like a moment, and maybe those little moments allow a little bit of pause.
On the one furthest to the right, I get a feeling, but it's kind of in line with like how it's very bright and yellow and white. It's just like it almost feels like a screen. It like feels like it's like blowing off the canvas, and that push against my eyes, I kind of like that feeling because it kind of feels like this like ADHD assault on my nerve endings, and it's so interesting because I can like draw parallels to like certain experiences like I have like in modern day of just like getting bombarded with information all the time, and so to see it in like a painting about like spirituality and like religious kind of literature, like it's interesting. That feeling is very bizarre.
I just want to jump into, sorry to speak so much, but I have one more reference for you, Joe. Alice Coltrane, even though musician, she created this short TV series of meditations. I think it's called like Eternity's Pillar, or like Pillars of Eternity. It's on Criterion, but Alice Coltrane, and she did a really interesting thing where instead of creating images, she said the prayers, like many different prayers from different religions in those languages, and she would recite them, but with like a lot of feeling. Like what she was saying, she felt in her bones. And that was an interesting way of her like amalgamating all of these differences into a way of performing them.
I don't want to end on a note of that the paintings are necessarily failing to demonstrate affect. They may be succeeding in refusing it. That may be what they're actually about. But again, Joe, I'm not clear on that from what you say about them. I mean, the very, let's postulate for a moment, a very cold-eyed imagining of the world that Grant was describing, of sort of affectless cultural or random arbitrary cultural consumption. And that these images are narratives of that. I mean, that's a possible interpretation. But you have to, you know, if, I don't know, and I'm not asking you right now how you feel about that. But I think that's something to be considered.
Stephen, how do you put these like sort of in relationship to somebody like Kenny Scharf?
That's a really great question. I think they're cousins. You know his word, Joe, Kenny Scharf? But because Joe is using these like directly quoted religious elements in a way that Kennedy doesn't, it makes it potentially more fraught.
It's a different vein of New York 80s culture where Kenny Scharf sort of takes graffiti and turns it into something kind of
Like a cartoon.
low-high
Right,
art.
right.
This sort of takes the sort of Buddhism shops, the incense, and turns it into kind of, you know, they are smaller. I think that the scale of them puts them in a different category than Kenny Scharf. But I could also imagine you making, I mean, I think that one of the main characters in your world, we could call testosterone. That there's a kind of like gendered, I'm interested in the way gender performs in these paintings.
In what do you?
Well, I think that like literally the like there are no, most people have, maybe these ones, like they look like they go to the gym all the time. You know, like that pony, the pony that was like really sort of like muscular, the sort of intensity of these goblins. You know, I think that that's also a strain of contemporary culture where it's like, are you sort of like watching a rom-com, or are you watching like Lord of, whatever that's called, Lord of the Rings?
Lord of the
And where people are, you know, like it's like a war movie, or it's, you know, I feel like they are caught up in sort of like contemporary gender genres in that way, which make them feel less like the kind of 80s kind of hippie Buddhism. You know, that is a sort of contemporary strain, and also the way that you kind of can't tell people's gender in a lot of time.
I wanted to go off of that, because when I look at your work, Joe, I think of a very specific era of album cover. Like, it's like mainly the 70s rock album, but there's an album by The Doors called Full Circle. It also, I think, contributes to the size of your canvas as well. Like, when you open up a vinyl, you have this, like, very specific size, and sometimes the cover, like, extends from one side to the other. And I'll send it to you. But there's this, like, interpretation of, like, religion that a lot of, like, these rock guys, I mean, the Sgt. Pepper album happened, and then, like, the Beatles have another album that I can't think what it's called right now. Or not the Beatles, the Rolling Stones. And it's, like, almost
His
like
Satanic Majesty's.
yeah, like a turn to this kind of religious interpretation through music, but it's their own interpretation of it. Kind of like going off of what Grant was saying too. I think I don't want to repeat it because I think you worded it really well, but it's interesting to see that in terms of a contemporary lens, like with AI, because with theirs, it was very much the 70s and early 80s. Like, I mean, ELO also has a couple of album covers that are very much into this, and maybe, I don't know the artists that do those. Like, maybe their artwork would, like, lend, like, good references into, like, kind of their world building that they go into. That was like a jumble of words, sorry. I had to like get it out.
Well, I think in those things like Sgt. Pepper, or back in that, or you know, a lot of albums around 1970, that the common notion was more lighthearted, you know, sort of like
Right.
scandalizing, you know, by throwing together traditional cultural things with pop cultural references.
But this doesn't have
More or less
like-
arbitrarily. But I think by this time that sort of thinking has gotten codified in a different way, much more intricately codified. And also the politics of cultural appropriation are so much different now than they were 50 years ago.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about too, like it's like right there with cultural appropriation, but every time I look at something like, especially just one on the end, I'm like, how will people intake that? And like, it seems a little careless almost. And I think you should take a little bit more consideration with it, but
But then it kind of brings up the AI question.
yeah.
Because we come full circle, because that's also what it does. It like
Yeah.
rips things from like, it picks up patterns.
Yeah.
Like that's its job. So
Yeah.
it's like ripping things from other things that it learns, that is fed into it. Careless is a wild word to put into this, but yeah, like it doesn't like think about it, because there's obviously so much thought in the pattern and what's being put into this and the paintings.
Yeah,
So
but
there is
like-
thought to it.
When I say carelessness, I mean like think about somebody who is like deeply rooted with their religion. When you
Mhm.
see like in these paintings, you're like, is he a part of this, and what's his connection to it, and
For sure.
like his consumption of that religion too. That's why I'm like careless. Like you don't always know, but like that's not.
No, yeah.
Yeah.
But then also, again, like the AI word is so
Yeah.
necessary in that artistry, because without it,
I know.
I
Yeah. That's
agree.
what I was like.
But
this
then
is, like,
with it, I'm like,
before.
oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
I agree, but I feel like I'm kind of on with Veronica. I don't really see AI as like a visual reference, maybe like the amalgamation of all these cultural references being in the same place, in the same style might refer as AI, but again, like AI in the art sense is mimicking the fact that us humans can render an interpretation with all this information in a painting. So I feel like, the artist comes first and AI comes later. And AI is so good at on that point, that's why you can associate that with AI. But again, to my point is like even religious iconography, to me, like someone who is interested in history and religion, who took some classes on religion and iconography, is like to me, I understood it as like it's such a hierarchy thing, like depicting a religious, very important person in the image of a certain group of people or a certain representation, and then making them such a holistic figure for worship or for people to regard as something very important. And I feel like it. To me, I don't really see Joe trying to start a cult with these. Like he's not trying to use these religious imageries to say oh, people should worship these. I feel like these come from a fascination because they're so patterned. There's so much patterns. There's a lot of different there's really cool stuff. Basically things that you can say, oh, this is cool, really cool. Because there's fires, there's thunders, there's these macho figures with goblins with blazing swords on top of these white horses, all fighting and battling, or there's this overhand form
Well, but that takes us back to Grant's point about consumption. What you're just describing is a form of consumption. It's cool.
Yeah.
And so the
I'm saying that's what it's doing.
yeah, right. So you would agree with Grant in that sense.
Yeah. I think I don't know how. My question is how can Joe take it more seriously?
How can what?
How can Joe take the subject matter more seriously? Is my question. Because.
But the debate has been around whether that's the same as the question of whether it's a failure of feeling or a success of affectlessness. It's not. I mean that depends on what you think these paintings are trying to do. If you think he's genuinely trying to create sort of religious atmosphere, that's one thing. If you think he's that it's about the consumerism of a religious atmosphere, that's another thing.
I feel that Joe is trying to get like this.
Sorry, can you speak up a little?
Yeah, I feel like Joe's
I
trying.
just want to say, I don't think that it matters. I just don't want to get into a conversation about what we feel is Joe's intention. Like, it's up to us to describe our own feelings. You know, you have your own subjectivity, and I'd rather you bring that to bear on it than, you know.
Well, just, I didn't mean what Joe, you know, knowing Joe's subconscious, I mean, what I meant is how
Yeah.
they're taking the paintings. Are these
Yeah,
paintings?
no, I
for-
don't mean in terms of what you were saying.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
I just don't want to
Yeah,
venture too far down that road.
no.
Like, I am curious what you guys actually think about that, because, like, what sort of, you know, do you fall on the side? Like, how do you feel about, like, sort of the consumerism that is not, you know, it's not Joe, right? We do live in a world where things are being, through media, I mean, imagine how much in our world is sort of losing its maybe background or its origin because it's being sort of repurposed. Words like the Amazon, for example. You know, what do we think of when we hear Amazon? Like, you don't think of a rainforest. Like, there's like semio-capitalism, right? Like, capitalism works, like, this is a form of semio-capitalism in that it's maybe not words, but it's symbols that are sort of being used, reappropriated in a different context. I mean, the bright colors, the backlitness, is that a critique? I think that's what Stephen's asking.
Mark.
In these pieces, I feel like these symbols, kind of like what you were saying, kind of have like this monastic view, maybe not towards like a traditional spirituality that, you know, we kind of think of like in that sense, but more in a modern sense of like what spirituality could be, or like what spirituality is. It is like kind of like this all over data-driven kind of like thing.
Wait a minute, spirituality is an all-over, data-driven kind of thing? I don't know what that means.
I don't know either, but what
Do you mean in the
but
sense
what I'm
of
curious about
progress?
these paintings more so is that it is a lot of symbols, and I'm wondering is like, can you get like this like at some point like I don't really care that I'm seeing the Buddha. I've seen the Buddha 1,000 times. Like, can you, without trying to be too prescriptive, can you get like this monastic kind of feeling without like explicitly having this symbol? That's how I feel about it, because there's a lot of interesting things there, and like all the interesting things is not the Buddha to me, it's everything around it.
I agree with you, but then I ended in a kind of opposite place because I'm most interested in these symbols like that. I don't think I could be 100% wrong. I don't think in Joe's that there needs to be some sort of like loyalty to the origins of Hinduism and describing that you need to have some real feeling about it, like because it is a symbol. And it is a symbol amongst a bunch of other symbols that we encounter, and I feel like in this capitalist dystopia, and I feel like that is the point, is that it kind of recognizes that. And it is just kind of about what seems to me to be his individual world building about how he can understand himself through all these like symbols and representations that don't really make, I think the point is that they just don't really have a real meaning except for the one that exists inside your own head. And I think with this one, like especially, so in that sense I'm like, I don't really get why there has to be a feeling personally, but I think like what is interesting most about this one is that there's such amazing contrast between the two parts of the painting. You have like the one tree, you have the bunch of trees, you have the one guy, you have two, and then I feel like somehow within the contrast, that's where the commentary can lie. Yeah.
Okay.